So with further ado, let's bring this compassionate and mindful and wisdom-filled man, Nipun Mehta.
Thank you. Thank you. I was busy cracking up in the back listening to Stefan. Let me see if I got this on. Oh, I want to talk about this idea, be selfish, be generous. This was actually a billboard in the Silicon Valley. I'm from the Silicon Valley. This ended up staying up for a day until they realized they can't put logos on the Dalai Lama, so they finally took it down. But this idea, it seems like a paradox. Right? If I am generous, I give something to you, I have less of it myself. And if our worldview is purely external, it's purely material, then that zero-sum game does apply. But as soon as you start to count the inner experience, then all of a sudden the calculus changes. Listening to Stefan's story actually reminded me of a really beautiful story that touched me. One of my friends was teaching a small class, and the topic was goodness, and everyone defined goodness in their own different ways. And the question was, how did you learn goodness? So people raising their hands. This one guy raises his hand, and he says, I learned goodness from my 5-year-old. And so everyone's kind of curious, well, how did you learn it? And he says, well, a few years ago, it was Christmas. I took my son to Mexico, and because they had roots in Mexico, and 24th night at midnight, you know, the 5-year-old gets to open all of his toys and gifts, and he's super excited, and he loves these gifts. Next morning, 25th, a kid from the neighborhood slums is passing through their door, and so dad says, maybe this is a learning moment, this is a teaching moment, so let me ask my son to give him one of his toys. So son, why don't you share one of your toys with the kid that's passing through? Son's like, no, Dad, I just got these, I'm not going to give them away. And Dad's like, no, son, why don't you, talks about sharing and convinces him to, begrudgingly, of course, the kid's like, okay, fine, I'll give him one of my toys. And the kid, being enterprising, probably like a lot of us, certainly like me, looks at Dad and is like, okay, I have to give away one of my toys. And he has a couple of toys, so which one is he going to pick? His least favorite one. So he grabs it and he's about to go, and Dad looks at him and is like, son, not that one. Why don't you give him your favorite toy? And the son at this point starts crying. He's like, no way, Dad, I'm not going to do that. And he kind of throws a tantrum and this whole thing. But in this typical sort of Lion King, Simba, and Mufasa moment, Mufasa's like, son, give him your favorite toy. Son goes. And as the son goes out to give away his favorite toy, Dad's thinking, when he comes back, I'm going to, congratulate him. He did a great job. I'm going to, maybe get him another toy just like that. And he has all these strategies in his mind. Lo and behold, his son's coming back with a big smile on his face. And he comes back, looks his dad in the eye, and he says, Dad, that was amazing. Can I do it again? And really, if we understand that, I don't need to speak for the next 40 minutes. And that's been my journey. I think that's been a lot of our journeys. When we do an act of kindness, we don't need much else. It just feels right. It feels like, yeah, this is how I want to do it. And there's a huge inner experience to it, which is very native to us. A lot of neuroscience now is telling us this. But that connection is almost hard to find. I mean, it's especially because we don't have spaces to exercise that connection. This is probably what most of us are used to, things where we would engage with that spirit of connection is now taken over. Someone was telling me this interesting study. They asked young kids, if you had a choice of giving up one of these 3 things, what would you give up? Choice A, internet. Choice B, smartphone. Choice C, sense of taste. 72% chose sense of taste. And why is that a little appalling? It's appalling because the thing is that we all want connection. But when we lose connection to ourselves, we feel like the connection we're getting from this is the best we can do. But if we learn to have spaces where we actually connect with ourselves, of which taste is a part, but of which so many other things are a part, then we realize a very different possibility. So we have been looking at that idea, I want to start with this guy's story, though. This is a fellow named Adam Grant. Adam Grant is one of these givers. He was a young kid, and at 14, he says, I want to be a diver. He goes to the high school diving coach, and he's like, I want to be a diver. He's like, okay, let's see what you got. Coach looks at him and he's like, no, anything but diving. Go somewhere else, some other team. Adam's like, no, I just love diving. This is what I want to do. And then coach is like, you're not going to make it, man. You just don't have the raw materials. But Adam's really determined. He practices hours and hours every single day, makes it to the Junior Olympics. Right? Went to Harvard. He's also a very sharp guy. Went to Harvard, and he makes it to the team there. The team makes it to the NCAA championships. Big deal. Right? In the finals, he makes it to the final round. Everyone wants to win the championship. Adam's in the final run, and he looks at a guy in the practice round, and he's like, hey, buddy, your dive is a little off. You should actually fix it like this. You'll do better. That guy actually did better. He got number 1. Adam got number 2. Silver. Not quite good, and he's like, darn, should I have helped him? Should I not have? That happened 1 year. Next year, he's again in the finals. And again, he notices somebody making a mistake in a practice dive. And again, he feels compelled to go help them. And again, that guy gets first place, he gets second place. So in his mind, he is thinking that, you know what, nice guys kind of finish last. If I'm always helping other people, how can I win top place? I want to win. Yeah, it means a lot to me, but I also want to help. And so he had this hypothesis in his head that if you're a giver, if you're a kind person, if you are generous, that you're going to be at the bottom of the pyramid. He ends up being very successful in the corporate world, ends up being the youngest tenured professor at Wharton, and he starts doing a lot of research on this topic. He says that there are 3 types of people. There's the givers, there's the takers, and then there's the matchers. Right? Givers are always giving, like him. Takers are saying, look, it's just about me. I'm going to maximize my self-interest. And matchers are saying, look, if you're a nice guy, I'll be nice to you. If you're not a nice guy, I'm going to put boundaries. Right? Reasonable hypothesis. Now, he went and started studying where you find these givers, takers, and matchers. He, of course, went to the bottom, and he says, this is where the givers are going to be. And they were. There were a lot of givers at the bottom. And then he kind of looks at the middle, and he kind of looks at the top of these pyramids, and he's like, wait a second, givers are actually everywhere. It's got nothing to do. Your success has got nothing to do whether you're a giver, taker, or matcher. Right? You can find givers, takers, and matchers everywhere. And in fact, givers have a very different way of succeeding, and they have a whole lot of advantages. So he started looking into giving as sort of this way of approaching corporate life in particular, in his case. And he saw that givers have a lot of advantages. He says, look, they're very motivated. Right? They're enthusiastic, have a lot of willpower, and they burn out less. This is interesting. I mean, he has a lot of data on this, but there's this woman, Elizabeth Seeley. She did this experiment. She says, okay, here's a hand grip. You clasp, you hold on to the hand grip. How long can you do it? On average, people did it 25 seconds. Right? Then, and before you come in, by the way, there's like some cookies on the side, and you can't look at, you can just look at it, but you can't eat it. It's supposed to, I don't know how they come up with these studies, but they're supposed to test your willpower and torture you a little bit. And then you go do this, right? So you've exhausted some of your willpower, and then you're doing this. Then they did the same thing, but this time just with givers. And when givers did the same experiment, they were less attached to their physical bodies, and they were able to clasp onto it for 35 seconds on average. So they have a stronger willpower, they burn out less. There's all kinds of different advantages in networking. Now we live in an era where we have so many dormant ties, especially with the advent of Facebook and things like that. We have a lot of ties that we sort of know loose ties, people that we're not in constant contact with. Now imagine hearing from somebody and they're a taker, and you haven't been in touch with them. You're not really interested in them. But if they're a giver, you're like, yeah. So givers have this incredible advantage of being able to tap into their dormant ties in their network. Then they're more collaborative, they influence people, they lead in a very different way. So he goes down this whole laundry list of advantages of givers. Oh, you guys want to see this? Go ahead, photograph. I'll get out of the way. This is incredible. It's in a book called Give and Take. He's a great guy. So the question then becomes for, I think a lot of us, is what does it take to really create this kind of a giver culture? How can we create that kind of a giver culture in our small communities or at a larger scale? Turns out the answer is kind of simple. It just takes a consistent contributor. Consistent contributor is somebody who looks for the collective good first and the personal good second. It turns out that in any group, as soon as you just have one consistent contributor, it starts to turn the conditional contributors, the matchers, into givers. Right? And the whole group benefits. They've done a lot of research at Kellogg on productivity in a group. If you just have these consistent contributors, all of a sudden, the walls start to go down, trust starts to go up, collaboration starts to go up, synergy starts to go up, and productivity skyrockets. Right? But in layman's term, it means this. In a larger group, if someone consistently acts as a friend, it's easier for others to act as friends, and everybody benefits. So we've all seen this somewhere, right? This is a photo of my parents' home on a Wednesday, typical Wednesday. My parents host a lot of people in their home. And the way they do it is, particularly on Wednesdays, they say, look, come in here, we're going to move the couches out, and you just have space. Very humble kind of offering. We're just offering space. In this space, you just sit in silence for an hour. In the second hour, you do a little circle of sharing. And in the third hour, my mom says, I'll feed you. I'll feed whoever comes. Initially, it was 18 years ago, it was me, my friend, and my mom. And since then, my mom has probably fed 40, 50,000 people in our home. It's remarkable, right? I mean, they've just done this, just no brands, nothing to sell, no donation box. It's just love. It's just one-way traffic, and people benefit from each other. They're not even they're just in the background. But so one thing that you see, this is just a group of us that were at the end. So one thing that people at the end have to do after dinner is wash dishes. Right? That's part of the game. And that's where I've seen people fighting to do the dishes. Everybody comes, they have this thing, and they're kind of flowing with gratitude, right? But it's the most amazing thing because husbands and wives both have been like, how come you don't do this at home? And why are you volunteering? And they're like, no, I want to do the dishes. And the reason is because there's enough consistent contributors that say, starting with me, I'm like, look, I don't care. I'll do everybody's dishes because I feel so grateful that everyone has held space in this way. I don't mind. And if there's enough of, if there's just one consistent contributor, you start to take the conditional contributors, turn them into givers as well, and pretty soon, that just becomes the culture, and people are fighting to do the dishes, and this is every single week. So it's a remarkable thing. So ultimately, I think what we all want to do is take this, is broaden the spectrum towards giving. Right? It's to amplify that givers. This is what we want to do. Right? What we actually have, though, is a very different culture. This is Reid Hoffman, founder of LinkedIn. Most of you probably heard of LinkedIn. This is his quote from 2011 in the Wall Street Journal. He says, social networks do best when they tap into one of the 7 deadly sins. Facebook is ego, Zynga is sloth, and LinkedIn, his own company, is greed. And that's fine, but we have to ask the question as society, where's the 7 amazing virtues, and what are we organizing around those virtues? It used to be that we had a gift. Oh, I pressed him too fast. It used to be that we had a gift culture way back in the days in indigenous cultures all around the world. Then we started to have some barter, then we had some commerce, and now what we have is a kind of casino system. If you look at majority of the money, or you go and buy, and you're getting your coffee and stuff, that's very small percentage of what actually is happening with the larger money supply in our economies. And here's a little, you can't see you can't see on the bottom, that's actually a countdown from 2007. These are the number of stock trades in a particular day for this one particular stock that they've measured over time. And it starts at 2007, and you can see that there's some amount of activity that's going on. And over time, you now have, with the advent of high-frequency sort of trading, you just have this incredible spike in all of this. It used to be in the Native American cultures that, they have this famous design principle, seventh generation principle, that if I make a decision, I got to think at least how is this going to affect 7 generations down the road? And now we're saying not 7 generations, not 7 years, not 7 months, not even 7 weeks. Right? This is like EU actually passed a law a couple of years ago saying, please hold on to your stock for at least half a second. Right? Did it already go through? No, it's still going through. It's a pretty remarkable thing. Maybe we can just take a moment to just see what we are doing with our markets, in whom we have a lot of trust these days. And it doesn't even go to 2015. It's like it ends way sooner because it's gotten much, much worse. I bet if this were to continue on till 2015, we'd be way off the charts, right? So what we really need to do is we need to shift from casino to the side of gift. And how are we going to do that? How do we create this culture of gift? Now, if you look at this spectrum, what do we see on this side that's different from what we see on this side? Well, on this side, on the side of gift, what we see is a sense of connection to our inner values, to this inner experience, to this inner transformation that was spoken about earlier. So on one side, we have extrinsic motivations, money, power, fame, and on the other side, you have intrinsic motivations. Right? This is knowledge, purpose, compassion, kindness, forgiveness, so many things of that sort. Now, typically, we had these 3 circles in society. We had the private sector, which was very good at solving certain problems, and it led with extrinsic motivations. And then you had this voluntary sector, which was very good with intrinsic motivations. And you had a public sector, in theory, that's supposed to balance this out. But what ends up happening is this. Right? You have this giant, hungry ghost of the private sector that's clearly taken over the public sector, and there's this small little thing called the voluntary sector, and they're like, no, wait, why should we leave that alone too? Let's do a sharing economy. Right? This is sharing economy. It sounds fine when you can share your truck for $9 an hour, but all of a sudden, when you start to take you start looking at your dog and you say, that's $5 a walk, like, there's something wrong with that. What's wrong with it? The problem with putting a price tag on every single thing is that we lose connection to the priceless. And we cannot, as a society, lose connection to the priceless. There's these arguments being made, right? In the US, there are 80 million power drills. An average power drill is used 13 minutes. Okay, yeah, we should share power drills. That's a good lesson. But you start putting price tags on all of this, if your mechanism for sharing is money, then it doesn't quite go into the inner experience, and that becomes very limiting. So how can we amplify the voluntary sector, the giver culture, a gift ecology? That's the question that we've been holding at ServiceSpace for the last 16 years. We started by building websites, as you heard in the introduction. We started by building websites and ended up doing a whole bunch of other things. But one of these interesting principles that we had was we decided to be volunteer-run and stay volunteer-run. What that meant was instead of having 5 staff working 40 hours a week, I suppose it's 30 hours a week in Sweden, that's awesome. I might move. You have 40 volunteers contributing 5 hours a week. The energy is clearly different. If you add it up, and internet allows you to aggregate small micro contributions from so many people without much overhead, which previously wasn't possible. But now in these times, if you add it up, it's the same institutional capacity. But imagine being a part of an ecology, I mean, it's one thing at 40, right? It's another at 400,000. Where you just have a very different kind of intelligence because people are all doing it for love. And that's extremely different. So we started by building websites for nonprofits. That was what we knew. This was in 1999, dot-com era. And it became like this big story in the Silicon Valley because we didn't want any money. We were saying like, hey, we're helping you, thank you for the opportunity. Because actually we get this experience from generosity which connects us and we feel great about it. Right? So we're actually feeling indebted to the people that give us an opportunity to serve, which is just didn't make sense apparently to the Silicon, because there were all these caricatures of us. They were like, look at these guys doing this work. They are crazy. And people read that, and that was the media response. People read that, and the human response was, I'm crazy like that too, sign me up. So lots of people came, right? And it's not like no trickery. This is just human. You try it, you do it. I say to everybody, if we all do an act of kindness, you don't need a marketing slogan, you don't need a brand ambassador. This is how we're wired to do it. So we started doing all kinds of things. We started to solve problems that money couldn't solve. For example, like good news in the world. For example, kindness. I mean, I'm told the organizers are going to give everybody smile cards through some secret mechanism that is not yet to be revealed. I didn't reveal. And so these smile cards is basically an experiment in kindness. You take a smile card. It's okay. So you do an act of kindness. You pay toll for the car behind you, or you pay for coffee for somebody else at a conference. And the person on the receiving end doesn't know who did this, but the smile card is a reminder that you've been tagged. Experiments in anonymous kindness is the name of the game, and now you're it. Pay it forward. See, if you had a strong, thriving voluntary sector, you don't even need a smile card. Because what is a smile card is a reminder to tell you that don't let the buck stop with you. And if you start to look really deeply into this, how in the world can the buck ever stop after 9 months of an incredible gift from all our mothers? That's how we start our lives. And so it's like you are always in debt, no matter how much you pay forward. And of course, as you pay forward, you get all kinds of things in return, and you're trying to pay that forward, and it's like a losing virtuous cycle. It's a beautiful thing, right? So it just becomes an example of that. I hope all of us do this kind of act. As you heard in the introduction, Karma Kitchen is a restaurant where you walk in and your check reads zero. It's zero because someone before you has paid for your meal, and you get to pay forward whatever you want for people after you. Of course, economists look at that, and they're like, what? Like, people are rational, and they optimize self-interest, what do you mean? You're going to trust them to pay forward? It can't work, can it? And we're like, well, if it doesn't work, we'll stop next week. We don't know. We're going to try it. And we tried it, and it worked, and it worked, and it worked, and it worked. Right? Tens of thousands of meals, 18 places around the world. Right? Not only that, UC Berkeley has done research on this now, because they came. One of our volunteers came, and she was a PhD student. She's like, this is mind-blowing. I need to study this. This can't really work. And we were like, but I wanted to. She was secretly hoping that it does. And she came out with this seminal study. And the title of it was Paying More When Paying for Others. So it does. Then we have these awaken circles, like the circles that I told you about. This is just a splice of it. There's like so many projects of people doing so many things. But the thing that brings all of this together, right? Every second, there's 2 emails that are sent out, to give you an example of this ecosystem. 2 emails every second, like it's close to 70 million emails. That's even a little bit more than 2 us every second, 24 hours a day. Not one of them has an ad. Not one of them, over the last 16 years, has ever even said bye. Right? I have many friends who have written amazing books. My own sister-in-law has written an amazing book. Doesn't say bye anything. It's purely in the commons, by design, on principle. And that creates, it's not to say that all that is bad, it's just that society needs a healthy voluntary sector, and we can all be a part of it. So what does science say about this kind of non-financial incentive? Right? This is Edward Deci at University of Rochester. He studied this for 40 years, and he categorically says that if you give these contingent rewards, you do this, I give you a carrot, right? Like the carrot and the stick model. You don't do this, you get punished. Categorically, he says that it just doesn't work. Right? He's one of the leading researchers on incentives. He shows, for example, these people who love to solve puzzles. And they love to do it just for their own intrinsic motivation. They love it, it's fun, it's enjoyable. And then they pay them to do the same thing. And then they stop paying them. As soon as they stop paying them, you would think they'd return back to their first state. They actually stop solving puzzles altogether. So he is saying that don't show me the money. When you're working with intrinsic motivations, money actually desensitizes us. There was another study, Max Planck Institute of Anthropology. They studied 18-month-olds. So 18-month-olds are just kind of playing, and all of a sudden they see somebody else hanging some clothes with a clothespin. And as they're hanging, the clothespin falls down. These 18-month-olds, who have no conceptual idea of the voluntary sector, a gift ecology, or a change in the world, they walk up, take the clothespin, and they give it to the owner because they want to help. We're wired to care. Right? In fact, there is no need for any rewards. This is just how we're wired. So we have a spectrum of motivations. We go from the extrinsic motivations, this is where you have this lack of generosity. Then you go one step further. When Adam Grant's book came out, the big headline in the New York Times was "Giving to Get Ahead." So this is sort of generosity as a strategy, where you're kind of like, wait, hey, look, extrinsic world is important. Intrinsic, okay, 1 foot there. I agree it matters, but not that much. And that's where you start to use generosity as a strategy. And this is great too. You go a little farther and you say, well, intrinsic is actually where the majority of my weight is, and yeah, extrinsic world matters a little bit. And this is where you start to see generosity as a way to really reconnect, right, very deeply. And then you have, on this side, where it's like very deeply rooted in your inner experience, and this just starts to be generosity as a way of being. So you have this spectrum. And on this spectrum, how can you create different kinds of institutions, different kinds of ways of organizing? On this side of extrinsic motivation, we have plenty of examples, thousands and thousands, millions of examples. Right? But as you go towards this side, you're in between. You have examples like Linux, which took on Microsoft Windows. Right? Linux, just an army of distributed volunteers that are creating an operating system that rivaled one of the, at the time when it came out, it rivaled one of the biggest companies in the world. You have things like Wikipedia, purely very much in the commons, and people's motivations are kind of somewhere in between. Some of it is like, I want this knowledge to get out, but a lot of it is just their inner experience because they measured the total number of volunteer hours that people make, that people contribute on Wikipedia, just through those micro edits, ends up being 100 million volunteer hours. And people who study this tell us that that's just 1% of what's possible, right, because of what the internet allows us to do. You have couch surfing that most of you have probably heard of. It upends existing institutions like the Hilton. And then as you get to this side, where they're purely, it's not just like fun and knowledge and even purpose. You start to get into things like compassion and kindness and healing and forgiveness. And you have some examples, but very few, like Alcoholics Anonymous. All over the world, distributed, decentralized, no central office, no staff, and yet it does remarkable work. And then you can even go farther out in the realm of compassion, and I think this is where we have very few examples, and this is where we need to create these ecologies, and this is where ServiceSpace works very explicitly through its own guiding principles. So you have this spectrum, you need a healthy spectrum. It's not to say one side is better over the others, each one has their pros and cons, but you cannot forget about this. That is definitely not healthy for society. So a lot of people look at the spectrum, and when you look at this side, one of the things that we fall in the trap of doing is to say, oh, this side is great, but how does it compare with the metrics of this side? If you look at it from those lens, you're actually selling this side really short, because the kinds of things that can happen here, you simply cannot do over there. Of course, there are things you can do there that you couldn't do here, so it's totally different. Right? But we need to sensitize ourselves to that different possibility and open ourselves with creativity to create things that are totally different, to create spaces where the rules of interaction, the rules of engagement are totally different. I'll give you an example. This is Karma Kitchen. I told you about this restaurant where everyone pays forward. Right? That sounds good. And then, of course, the first question that everyone would have is like, okay, well, if everyone pays forward, does it work out? You're kind of going on this side and saying, oh, are you able to make your bills? Right? Are you able to make all the payments? And that's a reasonable question, but it's not really, it doesn't tell you of like the real value that's generated in a space like Karma Kitchen. This is a sample weekend. Everyone's a volunteer every single week. When it happens in different frequencies. In India, it happens 7 days a week. In Berkeley, we used to run it 1 day a week. And when we run it 1 day a week, all kinds of, we have volunteers take on this restaurant, and they get a check at the end. It says someone before you has paid forward, you pay back. And it confuses a lot of people, which is exactly what we want. We want to sensitize them. So this one guy walks in, and he's first time, he's with a group of people, and he's like, this can't really work? You mean everyone in this, no one is paying for their own meal in this restaurant? And like, interesting. Why is everyone happy? And like, why are they smiling? And they're like volunteering. Like there's a dude in the back who's signed up to stand on his feet for 6 hours and do all our plates. And the reason why he's doing that is so I can have an experience of generosity. He's like, what gives? Like, why is that guy doing that? So he's kind of processing this whole thing. At one point, the waiter comes and he's asking who's a volunteer. And incidentally, he was a PhD student at UC Berkeley. He himself was like trying to grasp it. And so he's like, I'm going to volunteer and really see what's behind the curtains. And so he's kind of coming, and at some point they have an interaction, and this guy's like, hey, nice t-shirt. And it was a Karma Kitchen t-shirt, and so he's like, where can I buy one of those? And this guy's like, we don't really sell anything in this place, so I think you just have to volunteer. You can't really buy this, it's. And so the guy's like, oh, that's too bad, because I really liked it. It was a good t-shirt. Okay, they have this conversation. This guy goes in the back, he comes up to me, and he says, Nipun, do you have an extra shirt? And I was like, no. He wanted a Karma Kitchen shirt. I was like, no, I don't have an extra Karma Kitchen t-shirt. I've got another t-shirt. I thought maybe you spilled something, So I was like, I've got another t-shirt. He's like, okay, cool, I'll take it. He goes, changes t-shirts, takes the one he had off, makes it in a nice little package, puts a little note on it, and the note says, please laundry before using. And he hands it to this guy. And this guy is completely, first of all, he's trying to understand the concept, and now he's like totally blown. He's like, what kind of place? Like, where a waiter's like, nice shirt, and the guy takes off his shirt and gives it to you? You're like, wow, where have I landed, right? So he's still processing. A few minutes later, he calls the server back, and he's like, hey, I work at eBay, and we get these gift cards, and I just think what you guys are doing is really special. And so here's these 2 gift cards that are $50 each. And this guy's like, $100 like for a t-shirt, that could be a good business model, So he's like, okay, well, that's a lot. Well, thank you, that's very kind of you. And then he comes to me and he's like, this is what he gave to Karma Kitchen. And I was like, well, that's great. What is Karma Kitchen, though? It's all of us. So why don't you just ask him to go and give it to a random table? So he goes up, he tells this guy who's like who's still understanding the concept, and now he's just given $100 for a t-shirt, and he's like, well, thank you for your offering of gratitude, but Karma Kitchen is actually all of us, so why don't you just go to a random table and give this to them? And this guy's like, who are these people? Like, what? And he's like, no, look, this is where, it was too much for him, so he's like, I'm sorry, I can't, I'm an introvert, so I don't really can't. And so this guy's like, okay, I'll do it. You just watch. He goes to a table, first table. They'd also never been there, as it turns out. Mom and son. Mom had brought her son with piggy bank to make an offering for somebody after, because he wanted her son to know what it means like to feel a connection to those before you whom you can't see, and pay forward for those after you who will never look at you in the eye and say thank you. It's like, of course, any parent would want that kind of empathy, right? And so they were just here, and they just ordered, and this was the first time. And this guy comes up, and he's like, ma'am, someone's cup of gratitude was overflowing over there, and they worked at eBay, and so they just decided to just tag a random they just wanted to offer this to you, and so here's a $50 gift card, right? And this woman's like, wait, am I in heaven, or what's it? You have money falling down on the streets? What's going on? And she's like, yeah, someone's cup of gratitude just overflowed. And the same thing happened over there on another table where he did that with the second card. And this guy is turning red, pink, and purple over here, and the server is super happy. I'm looking at this saying, wow, this is great, right? This is like so much love. And all of this overflowing is going to ripple out into the world in so many different ways. Right? This is stuff that is value that is generated. Those are connections that are created that you just cannot replicate in the other side of the spectrum. Those are incredible assets in society. So such a gift culture just has very different rules of engagement, very extremely different possibilities that are open to us. And this can be done. Thank you. This is Richard. Richard does the same thing with his magazine. He runs a magazine called Works and Conversations. He heard about this 15 years. He was running a magazine. He did it in the same way with subscriptions. He heard about this, 65 years old at the time, and he's like, this is right. Yes, I'm going to do it. He kind of straightened his back. We were having this conversation. I told him, Richard, what you're doing is too valuable to be sold. And he looked at, usually associate value with price, right? And he's like, yeah. And he kind of straightens his back, and he does it. He goes home, and he actually, this is how remarkable this man is, he actually goes home and writes a letter to all his subscribers, and he says, offering them a refund. And he says, from now on, I only receive offerings of gratitude. 8 years later, I was in his home, and I interact with him on a regular basis, of course, but I was at his home, talking to his wife, Rue, and Rue's like, I've never seen Richard happier doing this work. So this is just a very different kind of possibility. You could do it with a magazine. This woman, Twee, does it with her acupuncture clinic. Pay it forward. Most people say, well, can it work? Can it not work? She's able to make it work. This guy is a rickshaw driver in India. And this rickshaw driver, you sit in this rickshaw, and there's no meters. Now, I don't know if you guys have been to India, but usually when you say, I want to go from point A to point B, they're like, oh, that's just on the way, And you're going all the way around, and you're like, oh, you come back and you say, man, the ethics of this country, they've just gone down. But actually, if you go and live with that rickshaw driver, as I have, you realize they live in a very small place, and he has kids, and he has dreams for those kids, right? Just like any other person. He just feels shortchanged by the systems of society. And because he feels shortchanged, he looks at someone like me and he says, okay, time for tourist tax, It kind of does that. And you're like, okay, I can understand this side. I can also understand the other side. It's not the right thing. But who's gonna break this stalemate? Are you gonna have an NGO that's gonna lecture them and say, thou shalt not, you can't do that. So this guy says, I'm gonna break the stalemate because I believe in love. I believe in people's fundamental capacity to respond to generosity with generosity. And this is not like some big philanthropist that's doing this. This is a guy who would be a UN statistic, and he is saying, I'm going to run my rickshaw on a pay-it-forward basis. I need the money every single day from all my transactions, but I am going to shift from transaction to trust. And he decides to run his rickshaw on this basis, and everyone in the city is like, wait, well, who's behind where? Which organization? He's like, no organization, I'm just doing this, right? And they said, does it work out? Right? Everyone has that question, like, oh, are you still able to make your... And he's like, and we told him, everyone's going to ask you that question. And so he had a log. Right? He's like, well, you take a look. Right? Point A to point B. Some people paid more. Some people paid less. On balance, evened out. Right? On balance, it was there. It's like, yeah, this is where it is. But he said, but let me show you another book. This is where I asked people how they felt sitting in my rickshaw. And people are just moved to tears. People take vows for life because they are learning generosity and love from a guy that not only is unexpected, but he's putting everything on the line for love. And he is saying, I believe in people's inherent goodness, that if I trust them, that they will live up to that trust. What a powerful idea. So this can be applied, this kind of thinking, this kind of basis of paying it forward can be applied to so many things. It certainly can be applied in our individual lives, in our, in our immediate lives with our families, but also at a cultural level. What it ultimately does, I think, is connects branch tips to the roots. I think we're caught up in looking at the branch tips and optimizing for the branch tips, but for the branch tips to produce fruit that we can eat and enjoy, I love mangoes, right? But for you to get mangoes, you need a healthy tree, you need a healthy trunk, you need a healthy root system. And not just that, you can have a very resilient ecosystem whose roots go far beyond the capacity of just one tree. This is a photo of Hurricane Katrina. Right? Those were all houses on both sides. And this hurricane comes and everything is turned upside down. Everything is destroyed. Except these oak trees that have survived for thousands and thousands of years. Now, the reason why these oak trees survive is because they have roots. But it's not just that they have roots like all other trees. Their roots are connected to the roots of other oak trees. And sometimes these network of roots go as far as 100 miles. So here I am, one tree, and I've got roots, I'm mindful of that, but all of a sudden this hurricane comes, and I'm tested, my resilience is tested, and I'm saying, I need a little help, and boom, this whole network of 100 miles starts to give me strength, and that's how it survives. And this is the function of the smallest act of kindness. You take that smile card and you pay forward, or you just hold open a door, you hug somebody. I'm open for hugs tonight, tomorrow. The smallest things have this incredible potential to connect the branch tips to the roots. And when we operate in that way, a whole new solution set opens up right in front of our eyes. It was always there, we just didn't notice it. So I would end by saying, be selfish, be generous, change yourself, change the world. Let's all do acts of kindness. Thank you.